I have a confession. I didn't read a single book in high school. Don't get me wrong, I did most of my assignments, I turned things in on time, and I earned fairly good grades from my English teachers. But I never read a full book that they assigned. Instead, I read Cliff's Notes. It was like a short version of the book that only took a fraction of the time to read. In my defense, high school felt like a period of information overload. There just wasn't enough time to complete everything when sports teams, homework, my body changing beyond my control, getting into college, and failing to get girlfriends were all consuming my attention. So I turned to Cliff for help. I don't know who Cliff is, but Cliff, if you're still out there, thank you so much for saving me in high school. Today we have more advanced ways to deal with the feeling of information overload. We have technologies that specifically help us sort through the flood of information at work, home, and in our social lives. Social media, after all, is just a Cliff's Notes version of calling all of your friends to see what they're up to. Instead, we cure this feeling of information overload by scrolling our phones to get updates on friends' lives. If we believe the technology critics, social media as a cure for information overload has had several consequences. It's disrupted a lot of traditional institutions, including journalism, marketing, education, government, and especially politics. As with any cure, there's always bound to be side effects. I can't help but wonder how far back this process goes. How long have we been inventing technologies to help deal with our sense of information overload? And what negative side effects did those past societies deal with? Today we are going to look at the influence and side effects of a technology invented in the 1400s, the printing press. Although the printing press did not make books shorter to read, it did make them more widely available and to different classes of power. More copies meant cheaper prices, and cheaper prices meant larger audiences. Ideas are meant to be free, right? So as we continue to deal with the consequences of the internet's flood of information today, it's helpful to look back on the first key instance our world dealt with an information flood. It is a mind-bending story of Europe's largest religious institution, the Catholic Church, beginning to lose its power to a group of protesters who would soon start their own religion and go on to influence some of the most popular religious movements today. And also, a little warning for what you're about to see, this story deals with devils. Lots and lots of devils. You can't overestimate the power of the Catholic Church in the 1400s. The church wasn't just powerful in its number of followers. Before the invention of the printing press, the Pope had centralized control over how the ideas and messages of Catholicism would spread to other Catholic churches. Each church had a priest, and each priest had a Bible from which to read the Word of God to his followers. But not many people had ever read the Bible themselves, and most people of this time could not read in general. Books were rare, extremely expensive, and it was difficult to make copies. So the church essentially had monopoly control on not only the written version of God's teachings, but the priests had control over disseminating those teachings at church meetings. Suffice it to say, if you wanted to know what the Bible meant, you would have to go through the priest. Martin Luther was one of these Catholic priests. He lived in Germany, where he was also a professor of theology at a local university, and although he was devoted to the Word of God, he did not like how the church took liberties with its interpretations of the Bible. For example, in the early 1500s, the church needed to raise money for its military operations and missions to convert non-believers. And yes, I just said the church's military operations. Luther was not happy to hear that the church had begun raising funds by selling its followers indulgences. Even though this was not actually in the Bible, church officials were asking followers to pay money to have their sins forgiven. Pay for forgiveness. In the 1950s, we saw radio DJs taking bribes from record labels to play certain artists on the radio. This practice was called payola. And now here, in the 1400s, the church is essentially taking payola to absolve sins. But the church didn't stop there. It actually gets juicier. To raise even more money, one church representative was telling their followers that they could pay to have even their future sins forgiven, or even those of your dead relatives. For many, it seemed like a small price to pay for eternal salvation. It's safe to say that Luther was pissed about the indulgences. I imagine him staying up late into the night, like many of today's keyboard protesters, working on his heated response to the Catholic Church. And finally, on Halloween Day, 1517, Luther was finished. He sent his famous 95 Theses to a local church administrator. Luther didn't have one problem with the church, he had 95 problems. And, foreshadowing many of today's public beefs, he posted those 95 Theses out in the open. Luther made copies of his grievances, and copies were the new communication technology of Luther's day. Gutenberg's printing press was invented over 50 years earlier, and by 1517, there were over 1,000 printing presses in Europe that acted like an informal communication network of copies. Luther began printing more and more of his church criticisms in many pamphlets over the next few years. Now, it's important to point out here that most Europeans could not read. So Luther, acting like a media influencer, hired a popular artist as well as a songwriter to create shocking images and catchy songs for his pamphlets. And when I say that the images are shocking, I'm actually toning things down. In one image, called Origins of the Pope, there is a she-devil giving birth to the Pope. In a related image, called Origins of the Monks, there are 3 devils sitting on top of a structure used for public executions, birthing a pile of monks. Let me remind you that Luther's 2 most recent jobs at this time were priest and religion professor. And the best part is, the church came back at Luther and his followers. Even though the Catholic Church never directly addressed Luther's 95 Theses, the Church did print a series of their own pamphlets that criticized Luther by portraying him as a false believer. Oh, and you bet they also associated Luther with the devil. Apparently, if you ever wanted to disrespect someone in the 1500s, the devil memes were definitely the way to go. As his pamphlet spread from printing press to printing press, Luther found himself in the middle of a multimedia campaign to criticize the church, and so many people were attracted to the drama. In fact, we know that Luther's pamphlets sold more than 5 times the amount of the Catholic Church's pamphlets. In the first 10 years of the Reformation, it's estimated that the press printed over 6 million pamphlets. And the surprise is, 1/4 were Luther's. In addition to the attention-grabbing images and memorable songs, Luther's pamphlets had one more advantage. He printed them in German, the language of the common people. The church, however, printed its pamphlets in Latin, the less popular language of the reading and writing classes. This was now a public fight, and Luther was gaining a tremendous amount of momentum with people he had never met in person, people who only knew him from his pamphlets. By 1521, 4 years after Luther's original 95 Theses, the church officially banned people in its empire from reading Luther's pamphlets. But it was too late. Luther was airing the church's dirty laundry, and the printing presses and pamphlets drove a wedge into the church's monopoly power. And this is significant because, before these printing press debates, discussions about religion were usually limited inside church or the privacy of your home. And the discussion of church practices in public was, in fact, Luther's rallying cry for church reform. Debates about church should involve all readers, claimed Luther, not just church officials behind closed doors. Luther was not the first person to criticize the church. 1 century earlier, in 1415, another Catholic priest named Jan Hus also questioned the church's practice of selling indulgences, the very same thing that Luther criticized. The only difference is, Jan Hus was burned at the stake. He was burned alive for questioning the church's practices. So why did Luther's protest work out differently? Did the printing press cause the revolution in religious thinking that reduced the Catholic Church's power? There's no clear answer to these questions, but we do know that it would have been much, much more difficult for Luther to challenge the Catholic Church without this new communication technology. As we have learned, the printing press helped Luther's cause in at least 3 key ways. First, the printing press gave Luther a voice in every town his pamphlets were printed and copied. His choice of 12 to 30-page pamphlets meant that Luther could print a response to the Catholic Church in just one day, compared to the weeks or months it would take to print an entire book. These shorter yet more frequent messages seemed to help Luther build and maintain a relationship with his followers. Second, Luther's choice to print in German expanded his audience where the Catholic Church limited their audience by printing in Latin. Using this more common language made Luther seem more approachable. He was on the same level as his followers, and not above them. Third, Luther's message was reinforced through other media like the many woodcut drawings and the popular songs that were printed in his pamphlets. If Luther's words could only be read by the few who were literate in any given town, the images and songs would be experienced by many more people. Like any good meme, the images in Luther's pamphlets didn't just tell readers why the Catholic Church was wrong. They showed his followers how to feel about the Catholic Church's wrongs. Today we are dealing with many changes in the way we receive news and information. All of us carry a printing press in our pocket, and that same device is also a newspaper, in addition to an endless number of other communication technologies. Just as the Catholic Church could not hold on to its monopoly power during the age of mass printing, today other legacy institutions are losing their power as those institutions realize they can't centralize or control information. News outlets realize that they no longer have singular power over distributing the news. Marketers realize that the peer-to-peer recommendations of social media influencers may actually be more powerful than a marketing company's strategic campaign. Even hospitals have come to realize that the doctors are not the most influential source of information about health. It's safe to say that we live in a time where news, information, truth, whatever you want to call it, it's all decentralized. There is no singular answer. Only answers to be debated, torn down, and built up again. Maybe it has always been incorrect to assume that one institution has all the answers. Ironically, the only institutions with centralized power today are social media companies like Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Companies that benefit from people arguing about what is true or correct. These are the true printing presses of the 21st century. Dang it.